One of the most famous communities from ancient Egypt was the village of Deir el Medina. This is where the tomb builders lived during the New Kingdom period, between 1500 and 1100 BCE. The artisans and their families who lived in this village were responsible for the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens, and the hills of the Theban necropolis in modern Luxor. Thanks to decades of archaeological excavations and massive quantities of written material, archaeologists and historians have a really detailed understanding of life in the village of Deir el Medina. One of the early golden ages for this community was around 1300 BCE, in the days of King Sety I. During this time, we can identify people living and working at Deir el Medina, and even connect them to specific tombs. In this live stream recording, I'm going to explore some of the tales from Deir el Medina during the age of Sety I. I do these live streams semi-regularly, although I need to get back into the habit because I recently moved from New Zealand all the way to the UK. If you have suggestions for topics you might like me to cover in future live streams, drop them in the comments down below. And if you're interested in getting early access to the recordings of these, you can find those on my Patreon, link in the episode description. Either way, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the show.
So we're going to talk about Deir el Medina in the age of Sety I, part 1, we'll say. Just as easily in the podcast, and I also want to provide extra history and context to what I talked about in the most recent couple of episodes. Numbers 197, which is where I'm really starting to get into the Deir el Medina things with the tomb builders working on Sety's tomb and also the village itself. So this particular image comes from the tomb of Senedjim, whom we're going to meet a bit later in this live stream. But as you can see, it's a really beautiful artistic piece that is well worth its attention on the live stream. So I realize not everyone's going to have had time to listen to the most recent episodes. You know, some people are kind of working. Some people go right back to the start. Some people kind of binge it. So I'm just going to give a bit of context. I will assume broadly that all of you are basically familiar with Deir el Medina, but I'll try to explain everything as concisely as I can. So the village itself has this orientation that you see here, north at the top, well, northeast really, and then south at the bottom. The local name for it, which appears in the written material, is Pardemi, or just the village. Doesn't seem like they had a specific name for it as an entity, which is kind of interesting. But it is part of the larger Set Ma'at, or place of truth, which is often confused with Deir el Medina, but it is actually a separate thing. The place of truth, at a very basic level, simply refers to a sacred space. You can have them in temples, but they are often associated with the necropolis generally, primarily in the New Kingdom. Obviously, the most famous and well-recorded necropolis is the Theban one at the west bank of Luxor, or Waset. So that led to a sort of confusion over whether Set Ma'at, or place of truth, refers specifically to this necropolis, or if it is a general term for cemeteries as a concept. Based on the scholarship that I've worked through, it seems to be the latter. A place of truth is a sacred space, especially a cemetery. We know about a few of them, including at Saqqara and Amarna, but the best recorded is in Waset. But that did lead to some confusion for many decades, and you'll still find it in the popular literature that Deir el Medina itself is called the place of truth, which is not strictly accurate. It's part of the place of truth. It's in that zone, but the village itself is not called that, and they don't call it that in their day-to-day writings. In their titles, their job titles, like worker in the place of truth, scribe in the place of truth, they will use that term, but that refers to their work in the entire necropolis area, generally. So one thing that I would like to set out is the zones of Deir el Medina. archaeologically, you can divide it up into 5 distinct sections, which are, there's supposed to be an animation there, northwest, northeast, southeast, southwest, and the central one in purple. We'll come back to this a bit later in the podcast when I talk about the house owners. But archaeologically, this is how scientists divide it up, and each of the houses has, a designation and a number so that they can easily understand, if they talk about house number northeast 11, an experienced archaeologist can go, oh, it's that one, right? Okay. But this just gives you an idea of the layout. You can see the very the very clear main street that starts in the first part of the village, and then with the Ramesside extension in the south, which happens around Sety I and Ramesses II. There's a deviation, which gives a new axis. Not entirely clear why they decided to shift the main street over. Maybe it had something to do with the topography. The hill here wasn't as suitable as in this section for the layout they wanted, but it does leave a very distinct marker where the village grows at a distinct point in time. So one thing that I would like to get across in the visual material, which I can't do so easily in the podcast, is how this whole area actually fits together and how centralized Deir el Medina really is. The choice of location is quite good, and probably a major reason why it was put here. So you can see Deir el Medina specifically here on the left. Yeah, you can see my mouse. That's good. And then just behind it to the south or southwest slightly is the Valley of the Queens, usually known as the Set Neferu, the perfect place or the place of beauties, depending how you like to translate Nefer. And these two areas are the closest, and they are connected by a little path or track that comes across these through this little section here. And I'm going to talk about that on the podcast, or possibly the next live stream, because there's some really cool stuff to talk about there, and I want to get into it, but I'll hold off for now. So the villagers live here. This nice little square building you can see is the major temple for Hathor, but it's a Ptolemaic construction. There were chapels and temples to Hathor during the earlier phase, but those all got demolished and replaced by this nice Ptolemaic one, which is interesting. And we'll talk about that in a couple of decades when I finally reach the Greeks. The other key thing to note here is that this kind of ridge running up here has a path, which you can just slightly see in in these white lines running along it, goes along the cliff face up here. And you can either go straight up to the very top, to the top of the mountain, the cairn or peak, or you can follow it along up here and also up here. And there's actually another cluster of kind of temporary huts or houses here overlooking the Valley of the Kings. And again, I'll cover that in the future in more detail. But you can see Deir el Medina here is kind of a long trek to get up here. It's about, as the crow flies, it's approximately just under a kilometer. I don't know how many yards or feet that is. So it's not an easy trek, and you don't really want to be doing it every single day, going from the Valley of the Kings up to the top of the hill, back down, all the way to Deir el Medina. So they do actually have a little temporary cluster of huts here where they would stay during the week. And then at the end of the week, when it was time for the day or time of rest, that's when they would come down back to the village properly. Again, I'll kind of get into more detail on all of that as we go in the future. But this is kind of the halfway point, or slightly more, and then you can descend down these lines into the Valley of the Kings itself, where they would actually do their work. Or, if you want, you can deviate along this ridge and come down into Deir al-Bahari, assuming you haven't just taken the easy path down in the lower levels. But looking at least from this lovely aerial photo, you can get a sense of how actually relatively clustered this whole zone is. It's quite a difficult thing to get across, especially in audio in the podcast or in writing. And it's even really hard to perceive when you're on the ground. You know, if you're going around by bicycle or bus, all of these places can seem oddly disconnected. But when you get a nice aerial shot like this, you can see how well attached everything is to everything else. Unfortunately, you will never get me into a hot air balloon. I am terribly afraid of heights, so I'm going to have to settle for this kind of view, thanks to Cairo Info for You, who, if you don't deep dive into Egyptology online, Cairo Info for You probably has the best collection of photos of ancient Egyptian material you'll find anywhere. His page is on flickr.com. I put a link to it here, and I'll add it to the recording. Basically, if there's a significant monument, or even less significant, he's probably got top quality professional photos of it, and he makes them available freely on his Flickr. Absolute 10 out of 10, best of the best. Highly recommend it if you're interested in anything visually. Go check it out, because Cairo Info for You, who I should note is an Egyptian, has done excellent photos of everything. So again, this is one of his photos of the village from the air. You can see that the hot air balloon tours kind of take you over all of the major sites, which is cool. And it really benefits somebody like me who wouldn't get into a hot air balloon to save my life. But this gives you an idea of kind of north is on your right, and then the village kind of stretches out here. The main entrance to the village is here at the north. The parking lot, ironically, is in the south. So whenever we visit Deir el Medina as tourists, and I hope all of you will get a chance to one day, we actually come at it from the wrong side. We should be walking up here from the cultivation, and then passing the Hathor temple, presumably purifying ourselves, or making an offering to the temple, and then coming into the village here. So this is actually, we approach it from the wrong direction today, which is unfortunate. I'm hoping that one day on future tours to Egypt, I can try and get permission to bring a group walking from the Ramesseum, which is just over to the southeast here, up to this track I kind of want to do more walking tours to give us a proper sense of the environment. But as you can imagine, that takes a lot of organization, backroom conversations with the local inspectors, make sure everyone's satisfied and happy and on top of things. So that's a pipe dream, but hopefully one day I can do it. It'd be really cool to one day, start in the Valley of the Queens, and we all just walk all the way along around to the Valley of the Kings eventually. That'd be cool. But anyway, the visitors center here, which is a lovely little just covered seating area with a tiny bookshop that is managed by the French Institute of Eastern Archaeology. Great little area to sit. Lovely bookshop. They've always got some really cool books, and I always want to buy them, but I can't. Then we have the early village here, and this is most of what I'm going to talk about here is based on the archaeological excavations, particularly of the French Institute. The French Institute has had the concession for Deir el Medina for over 100 years now, basically, with I think maybe a couple of small gaps. And occasionally other teams do work here as well, but primarily this is a French Institute zone. And the big grandfather of the archaeological project here was a man named Bernard Breuer, who led the clearance of this entire zone. I'll show you in a minute what it actually looked like before the excavations. He uncovered, or his team, I should say, under his direction, uncovered everything you see here. And then the French Institute ever since has been thoroughly documenting and studying them. Really, top tier Egyptological work. But as a result of all that work, they're able to identify the construction phases of the village itself. And we know that the 18th dynasty was this zone, which started under Thutmose I, or Amenhotep I, around, say, 1500. It expanded at least once under Thutmose III, say around 1470, give or take. And then it extended again around 1300 BCE, at least in the time of Sety the First it started, but maybe it was kind of an accumulation between Horemheb, Sety, and Ramesses II over like a 10-year period, give or take. But it expanded in this little section. That's the largest physical extent of the village. After that, the village has kind of reached its maximum size. It will briefly expand in terms of the workforce size during the 20th dynasty, but it never really gets much larger than this physically. The tombs, however, date from the 18th to the 20th dynasties. So we're looking at approximately 1450 to 1050 BCE, about 400 years. They cluster all the way along these hills, along here too, up into this little side valley. Some of the earliest tombs are actually in this removed area. And this whole section is just honeycombed with tombs, some of which, you can't even really see from the air. There are shafts and pits which are covered over, blocked up once they've been excavated. This whole area is just a rabbit warren of tiny chambers. Most of them are just maybe a shaft or a staircase in a small room, or even just a little kind of hole or pit, but hundreds of them. On the right here, we have the main Hathor sanctuary, the Greek one that I mentioned, but it sits on top, partially, of a chapel that was constructed in the days of Sety I. And I'll be talking about that on the podcast, probably the next episode, when we're going to talk about Hathor a bit and the Temple of Dendera as well. But there is this nice little sanctuary for Hathor that is very well preserved in the foundations and has a really nice layout up to this little sanctuary here at the rear. Again, I'll talk about that in the next episode, but this is kind of the layout of the village as it would have looked in around 1300 BCE in the time of Sety. And this is what it looks like before excavation. If we go back, see that? Totally covered with piles of rubble, sand, detritus. A lot of rock slides had, basically collapsed over the necropolis zone. This is the enclosure wall of the Hathor temple. This is where the village is. And you can see there were some little bits of the houses were visible, like these little plastered walls were partially visible around 1906. There had been some initial excavations as well. So they knew something was here. They knew that there was a village, but mostly it was just covered over with rubble. Some of this rubble were the dumps from earlier excavations, like around the Hathor temple. But it was a mammoth undertaking. Here's another view from the south, roughly in the area of the visitor center today, maybe a bit further north. There you have the Hathor temple, which the walls are very nicely preserved on that temple, like even to this day. And you can see there was they had put a modern path that actually ran right over the top of the village. So people were to come visit this, they were just walking over the top of Deir el Medina. But the whole area was just covered in debris, which was a massive undertaking for the Egyptian workers, who often don't get enough spotlight, but they do the work. They do the 99.9% of the labor is done by them. Archaeologists just come in, sift through what they've uncovered, and then take the glory, unfortunately. But this is how the project was basically organized. Very large work teams taking it away one basket at a time. In this case, it looks like they're dumping detritus from one area over to another, which eventually leads to the clearance of actual houses, which then get kind of cleaned up, carefully go through to find artifacts and items, sweep it down, make it nice and tidy, and then photograph it with a nice local worker for scale. But you can see things like little fragments of staircases, which are still left in situ in some areas. Most of the Deir el Medina houses would have had either a second story or at the very least a roof level with a staircase to access it. Obviously, none of those have survived the centuries, but we do have the staircases, so we know they existed. Another view of the village now that excavations have proceeded quite well. This little area in the middle looks like it might be this. Yep, I think this might be where that, around here is where that guy was standing. But they've also cleared part of the eastern section of the village. In this case, we're looking at the northern end. So this is kind of the 18th dynasty part, well, the part that was begun in the 18th dynasty and then later developed as over the centuries. And here's the village today, you know, beautifully clean and clear. This is viewing it from the west, about halfway along. So if we're looking around here, the 19th dynasty extension is roughly this area with the street. I think this is the street about here. So it can be quite hard to tell from the ground. And this is the area that was primarily built under Sety I, with the Hathor temple here on the northeastern side. And then way off in the distance, down on the floodplain, we have things like the Ramesseum in this area around here, and the nobles' tombs just over here. So very well connected by the sort of layout topography of the region. Deir el Medina is in a prime real estate, all things considered. Again, just more of the difficulty of clearance. You can see they're basically just using hoes and adzes, just like ancient excavators did, to clear away the rubble and detritus. This apparently, from the notes in the Museo Egizio archive, is a 20th dynasty chapel from a tomb, probably around the time of, sorry, not 20th, 19th dynasty, around the time of Sety II, based on the inscribed material on these blocks. But here are some of the local children and men that were involved in the work. Children have always been part of these large-scale excavations, both as diggers and as assistants, you know, water boys or carrying baskets, that kind of thing. This is one of the local Egyptian inspectors. You notice he's taken on the colonial dress to indicate his status and his education, sets him apart from his sort of local countrymen, and puts him in a position of authority if he dresses like the Europeans. Quite a common trend in the early 20th century, especially since the French, Germans, and English still held the lion's share of the political influence at the time. But these holes in the ground, in the things, these are either tomb chapels or the tombs themselves, which the workers excavate, and there are many of them all across these hills. You know, there'll be more underneath this rubble and over here as well, but it's a slow process. The work teams can get quite large, several hundred individuals at least, laboring away on these projects. So it's quite a massive undertaking, and the French excavations here lasted for decades, basically from the early 1900s. Well, there was the Italian mission first in the very start of the 20th century, and then the French took it up and worked here for, 30, 40 years, and then continue to do so today. Okay, so in the most recent episode, I talked a little bit about the individual households and the fact that scholars can pinpoint certain families or individuals from tombs and then connect them to individual houses in the village. So the main way that they do that is from written material and artistic records. And usually the first way they do it is that they identify the tomb owners. Whoever's depicted or decorated in a tomb, for example, a man like Senedjem, who was a worker, they'll have a visual record of that guy from a tomb. There'll be a painting that shows him, and the hieroglyphs will record his name and title. Usually that person will also be accompanied by members of their family, their wives, their children, their brothers, sisters, their parents, those kind of things, or perhaps by their clients or followers, people who are socially connected to them, even if they're not strictly family. Firstly, from that, scholars will build out the family trees. They'll say, Senedjem was married to Neferti, and they had children named Konsu, Kabeknet, things like that. Once they have strong records of how the family lines interconnect, they can start to compare that with the material that actually comes out of the houses. So written material like pieces of stone that were decorative or part of the architecture, or religious items, small stelae erected to the gods, which sometimes are in the houses themselves. If they find enough of those in a single house, that's a pretty strong way to say, okay, we're pretty sure this family lived here for however many generations. It's not a perfect system, of course. Items get broken or smashed up and scattered sometimes, so you don't necessarily always find them in one house or in the right house. But if you find a cluster in a particular house, that gives you a fairly strong indication that one particular family lived there. These are the archaeological zones that I was mentioning earlier. Southwest, southeast, northeast, northwest, central. And archaeologists have given each of these houses a designation based on that. So here's an example of one of the family trees and how extensive they can get. This is Senedjem, who lived in the days of Sety I and the early reign of Ramesses II. Thanks to the decoration in his tomb, pardon me, we can identify, his parents, his children, probably his brothers and sisters as well. And those can be further connected with other individuals who have their own tombs, like Karbeknet, which gives more records, which interconnect with other records, which interconnect with more. People can build out really extensive family trees. This is one of the larger ones, and it's from a book by Benedict Davies that I'll put in the bibliography, a really excellent book if you're interested in this aspect, like family trees, genealogy. This is the book to look at. But they can be really extensive, multiple generations, dozens of individuals for a single family, which, can kind of make your head spin if you're just kind of looking at it casually. But these are the sort of records that scholars are using to identify, first of all, who are the families? Who would we expect to be living in proximity or interacting with one another and leaving records of it? And then when you compare that with inscribed material like this door, it's kind of a small shrine door that's supposed to go in the house itself and on the wall. It's expensive because it's made of stone, but it's decorated with the two owners. In this case, Senedjem, who's on the right, and his son, Konsu, who's on the left, and he is worshipping Sobek. You can see at these little hieroglyphs here, like we have Chen Su, so that's his name, Chen Su, and above him we have his title, which is Sedjem Ash Em Set Ma'at, so servant in the place of truth, a worker in the Theban necropolis. But these pieces were discovered in this particular house, in the southwest corner of the village site, which is SO, or Southwest number 6. And there are many items of this, like at least 5 or 6, that gives us a pretty strong indication that this is Senedjem's house. This is where he lived. And, this house might have later on, as the family generations evolve, it might have passed into what we would consider a different family, either through marriage or descent. But around 1300 BCE, we can identify this is Senedjem's house. And this is true for pretty much all of the houses over the 18th to 20th dynasties. There are a few gaps. And obviously, for some houses, we know the inhabitants in one generation, but we don't know their inhabitants 5 generations later. So over time, there's also gaps. But generally speaking, most of the houses can be identified at least tentatively, which is pretty cool. This is Senedjem's actual house, as you see it today. This is the parking lot up here on the right. You come in through these doorways, and this is the main sort of entrance hall, I guess you would call it, with a column to support the roof, a small divan or seating area, and over here in the back, just behind this wall, is actually the staircase that would lead up to the roof. Just as an example of the sort of doorway emplacements, these are how they are reconstructed now with modern bricks. But they would have like stone lintels or door jambs, which have the names of the owners. Bear in mind that the workers of Deir el Medina, although we call them workers, they are still much wealthier than your average Egyptian farmer. So they are able to afford nice little embellishments for their houses because of the work that they do. Some of them can even afford wood for their door jambs, like this example from Bruyère's excavations. So now I want to talk about a couple of intact burials. Hold on one second. So Amir asks, do multiple people having a similar name cause problems, or is there a system to combat this? It does cause problems if the person doesn't. If we have multiple instances of, say, Khonsu, that's a pretty common name. Unless we have explicit information about, Khonsu, son of so-and-so, or Khonsu with this particular title, it can be difficult to identify a specific item or written record. If you don't have some strong details on the item itself, it's hard to say exactly who it belongs to. Fortunately, most of the time they do include those little family details, so-and-so son of so-and-so, or so-and-so who has this particular job title. That does give you more specificity. But yeah, sometimes it's a little bit ambiguous. If you are interested in that, I do recommend Benedict Davies' book, which I mentioned earlier. He goes through all of it, basically. And it's a little bit of a word salad in terms of like names, but you'll get a very thorough understanding of how many of these individuals are recorded and how much detail there actually is for a lot of them in terms of their connections. So I would say 90% of the time you can at least you can connect an item with a particular individual with reasonable confidence, but there are still plenty of instances where all we can say is that it belongs to somebody called Khonsu. We're not sure which Khonsu, but one of the Khonsus. Anyway, so I want to talk about some intact burials because Deir el Medina has a couple of them and they are lovely. And although most people know about the intact burials of like Tutankhamun, Deir el Medina has its own wonders to introduce. So again, all of the tombs are clustered up on the hillside here, and all of the discoveries I'm going to talk about took place in this area. So first we have a reconstruction of an ancient funeral. It's slightly, I think, embellished based on kind of combining people of different social statuses. But you would have these kind of small chapels with a pyramid on top, and I'll show you one in a second. And then down the bottom left, people bringing funerary items, raising the coffin up to perform the opening of the mouth ceremony and to make offerings to it before it actually goes into the chapel and then down into the tomb itself. We can reconstruct funerals like this based on this particular tombs like this, which is the tomb of Ra-Moza of the 18th dynasty. This is not at Deir el Medina. This is in the nobles' tombs a bit further north, not too far from Deir al-Bahari. But we have the things like the funeral procession. They're bringing shrines, which are the exact same kind of shrine that turned up in the tomb of Tutankhamun. He has one of these shrines with this exact decor, the little tiet knots and the jed pillars of Osiris. Possibly there was one of these was used for multiple funerals. There was kind of a communal shrine that would be used in these kind of occasions. But obviously somebody like Tutankhamun had his own bespoke one. And then we have the funeral procession, people bringing jugs of oil or drink or wine, furniture like the bed, boxes and boxes of boxes for personal belongings, chairs, small vases, things like that. Canopic chests, sandals, and then we have the mourners themselves, or the They're often interpreted as professional mourning women, but there's never anything in the text, in these texts particularly, that says that's who these are. It's kind of a general assumption. I think there is a job title that suggests a mourning woman, but there's no reason to assume that some of these might not also be his relatives. Then they bring bundles and boxes carried on the shoulder on poles, along with flowers to purify or make the air sweet. Tiny little jars, which we'll see later from the tomb of Sennacherib. These little jars carried on the shoulder poles. Often they carry ointments or cosmetics, things like that. Here they seem to be bringing the butchered remains of a cow on a small sled, but they are also bringing actual live cows as well. So I'm not sure why one of them is dead already, but there we go. And then it's damaged now, but you can see the coffin erected here with the little beard and people performing the opening of the mouth, purifying piles of offerings for the deceased. And then the goddess of the west, Yementet, often connected with Hathor, you can see her name here, welcomes the deceased into their chapel or their tomb, which is here. So that just gives an idea of how these funerals are depicted in Egyptian tombs, which then artists use to reconstruct them. And this is one of the tombs themselves. Because the people living and working at Deir el Medina are all professional artists, they also have amazing tombs of their own. This particular one belongs to a man named Amun-Nat. It's from the early reign of Ramesses II, approximately. And I put it here to give you a couple of things to note. First of all, the curved sort of barrel vault of the burial chamber, very common at Deir el Medina, which is interesting because usually most tombs have flat roofs, even for the kings. But in the Ramessid era, with the days of Sety I, Ramesses II, we start to see the royal tombs have these big curved vaulted ceilings. The Deir el Medina crafts artisans seem to do the same thing on a much smaller scale. They plaster the wall. You can see the wall here has been it's been reinforced with modern plaster and cement, but there's a thick layer of plaster here, the edges, onto which then gets drawn and painted the actual tomb. You can imagine that in any artisan who lives here is probably working on these throughout their career, chipping away at it literally over many years. It also appears that they were trading with each other to work on each other's tombs. One worker like Sennacherib, he's a builder primarily, so he builds his tomb, but he's not an artist. So he makes a deal with one of his colleagues to paint his tomb, and presumably in return, Sennacherib will build the other man's tomb. So they swap their jobs to assist each other with the burials. Again, that's something I want to come back to either in a podcast episode or in the other live stream I'd like to do about this, because there's some really interesting stuff to talk about there. But this just gives you an idea of the beauty of the decoration. They also have, lovely daily life scenes, really colorful, really vibrant, the nice big eyes and cheerful expressions, which I'm personally a big fan of. And we see them, sailing the waters of the next life, collecting the reeds, bringing the cows to pasture, nice fruit trees growing in abundance, small pools of water, and enjoying the sweet smell of a lotus flower, really trying to convey the idyllic world that they are looking to get. Patty asks, are these original colors? Yes. In most cases, they have been cleaned. They're sort of, people would, over the centuries, some people would squat or live in these little rooms, and the walls would get very blackened with soot. So mostly they have been cleaned and then often coated with a layer of modern varnish. But these are the original colors. They haven't been repainted. Another example from the same tomb cluster as Amun-Nat. They're all kind of interconnected, but I wanted to emphasize this one because Nebenmat here has really emphasized the gold idea. So in the Egyptian religious viewpoint, deities had skin of gold, and by the Ramesside period, people are thinking of themselves in the next life as kind of lower level deities, part of the Aku or Imahu, which are kind of a low rank level of god in the Duat. But because of that, they want to have the golden skin that the deities supposedly have, and somebody like Nebenmaat has conveyed that literally on the walls of their tomb. He's still kept the sort of reddish orange for the coffin because the coffin's made of wood, and he's keeping that idea going. But the tomb owner himself and all the deities have the nice golden skin. Just a little close-up example there. So obviously this is Anubis or Anpu, his name is here, and he's performing the opening of the mouth ceremony for the coffin and body of Nebenmaat. Okay, so the first, I should say, the earliest intact tomb of the community is Ka in Merit, which is Theban tomb or TT8. It was discovered in the early 1900s by the work team of Ernesto Schiaparelli. I did a mini episode about it a few years ago, but I'm thinking I might revisit that because there's a lot more detail to add. Ka, or kind of his name could mean like appearing, was the chief in the great place, a title that doesn't show up in the Ramesside community, but it seems to mean something like the chief tomb builder. And based on when he lived, he was probably responsible for building the tombs of Amenhotep II and Thutmose IV, and possibly responsible for finishing the tomb of Thutmose III. And obviously, if you're a fan of royal tombs or that, you know that these are all particularly lovely tombs themselves. And in thanks for his service, Ka was richly rewarded by the kings. He was given gifts personally by them, and apparently he was made quite wealthy because he was able to afford a truly lavish burial for himself and his wife, Merit, which includes things like this beautiful gilded coffin. It's made of wood, but it's got a layer of, looks like coppery bronze and gold on its features. And this was all discovered totally intact, had not been robbed or violated at all in the early 1900s. So TT8 actually has two components. It has a chapel, which you see here, where people could come and bring offerings for the memory of Ka and Merit, publicly accessible, not restricted necessarily, built out of a mud brick vault from a hollow dug into the hillside. We see it here after excavation and clearance. Looks like this on the interior. Obviously, because it was open, exposed, it hasn't survived that well. You can still see the beautiful decoration on the ceiling, like the swirling and diamond patterns, that kind of thing. But the plaster has collapsed badly, and a lot of the details have been lost or possibly intentionally removed, either through vandalism or to sell, unfortunately. But then just across the valley from the chapel, like physically separated, there was the tomb itself that was discovered. And this is the very basic architecture for it. And here are some of the photos from the excavation, which I only recently discovered in the Museo Egizio photo archive, which is why I kind of want to revisit that episode, because I'm pretty sure I could tell that story a lot more now based on these. But they're really cool. So you have a couple of Egyptian workers here at the entrance to the shaft, and they've reinforced the rock here, probably partly to keep it stable, but also to provide an anchor point for lifting objects out, strap a rope over it. But here in the corridor, we have the tomb itself before it was opened. At least that's according to the description caption on the Museo Egizio website, that this is during the middle of the excavation before anything was opened. I'm a little bit skeptical of that based on how tidy it all seems, but you never know. If we zoom in a bit, we have items stacked up on the sides, including here is the door to the tomb, still in situ, intact, closed. There's a story. I'm not sure if it's apocryphal or not, of that the entrance was so well preserved that when they opened it, or when they cleared this passage and came up to the door, Schiaparelli turned to his workers and said, "Does anybody have the key?" Which I think was intended as a joke, but it's very hard to tell, when it's just in writing. But sounds quite funny in hindsight. This is more after the door has been removed, and we have a view into the actual tomb chamber itself, also with much better lighting. So I guess maybe that original photo was legitimate in terms of the phase, but it has items like this is the bed of Ka, just sitting here in the corridor because they couldn't fit it into the tomb itself. You can imagine they've stacked up all the items inside, then they bring the bed, and they're like, "Ah, crap, we can't get it in," so they put it out here, along with some of the larger jugs as well. But this is how the tomb looked when it was opened on the inside. A really cool one, I think. Kind of has those Tutankhamun vibes, except the difference here is that all of the photos you see of Tutankhamun's tomb, that's after the opening, when they've been professionally lit and rigged up by Harry Burton and the engineering team. Here, 16 years earlier, this is much more just, we have an electric light outside the door, shining it in. Let's take a photo. So this is arguably even more authentic to the discovery than the Tutankhamun photos, as nice as they are. But it's photos like these are so great because you can still identify the items that are actually in the museum collections, including their, and you can physically pinpoint them within the tomb itself. So thanks to the advent of photography, we have a much better understanding of how tombs like these were ordered and laid out by the ancients. Covered in a shroud here is the outer coffin of Ka himself. Simple wood coated in black resin, nothing too fancy, with a like an angled triangular vault lid. That's the word I'm looking for. And then it opens up, and his other two coffins are nestled inside. And these are those two. Outer coffin here first, and then the middle coffin, or is that the outer? I forget exactly. Point is, they're very nicely decorated. Again, this one is wood coated with a black resin, but then embellished also with metal. Relatively simple detailing compared to what you'd find on somebody like Tutankhamun, obviously, but they still have very nicely carved details and very finely embossed hieroglyphs. So that should give you a sense that even though Ka is living and probably working and probably living at Deir el Medina, he is still very highly placed in Egyptian society, and he is still very wealthy as well, by comparison with most of the population. This is his wife, Merit. Her coffin, not quite as fine a quality, as you can see from the wonky eyes and the much less finely carved detailing on the coffin jewelry itself. I believe Merit may have died before Ka. I think that was the historical reconstruction. So some of her work might have been a rush job to ensure that she was buried properly. But you can see that Ka, very nice. Merit, not quite so good, unfortunately. Going back, we also have Merit's wig, or her hairpiece, which was contained in this lovely, nice wooden box, which includes her name, Merit, here, with the feminine determinative. She's called It's for her car specifically, but it's dedicated to her memory. Has a little handle here that can be tied up with string and then sealed with a mud seal if you wanted to keep it secure, which I believe you can see the traces of here, the string hanging down. And then it has the wig itself, which I believe is made of human hair, very finely braided or plaited at the ends, hairstyles that you'll still see in southern Egypt and in Sudan, Ethiopia today. Very, very common stylings, but very beautifully, finely preserved work. And you get a sense that this is something she's worn a lot, because you have the weight of it stretching at the top, leaving it thin over the center line of her head. Presumably, eventually she was going to replace this with a nice new rich one, but then she passed away. But something like this must have been incredibly expensive when you consider how difficult it would have been to make and weave, and how much time simply it would have taken to grow out the hair necessary to produce this really expensive object. So she was doing quite well for herself. This is Merit's mummy mask, which is a really lovely little piece, much nicer than her actual coffin. So, maybe that does kind of point to the idea that the coffin was a rush job, because it seems like there's much finer detailing in terms of faience and things like that on the jewelry. It's gilded. It's got the nice inlays of rock crystal and ivory for the eyes. So her mummy mask, at least, the item physically going on her body, is much higher quality, much more carefully preserved. It is damaged, unfortunately, because it sort of sinks a bit over time. It's not the most secure item, so they're not working at the royal level of quality, but they can still afford very nice pieces. These are workers removing the items from the tomb itself, including, looks like this guy has got this particular stool. It can be hard to tell. They're very similar designs, but anyway, you can see them carrying out the decorated boxes, usually on their heads, in the classic rural fashion. There's a nice little lamppost here, which has been reconstructed or copied, and there's a replica in the Cairo Museum. Removing more of the items. Here's the mask of Merit as it was discovered. Here's a lovely high-quality detail photo here from the Museo Egizio. Really, really amazing online resource, this particular museum. So I highly recommend checking them out if you're interested in these kind of, especially Deir el Medina. Museo Egizio is the place to go online. Now let's talk about the other one, which is Senedjem. So Senedjem lived around the time of Sety I and the early reign of Ramesses II. He had the title of servant or workman, which is Sedjem Ash, which literally translates as the one who hears the call, or the one who hears the summons. So basically somebody summoned to work in the place of truth, which is usually just shortened to workman or servant. He was buried in a tomb, which is now numbered Theban Tomb 1. So he gets pride of place in the classification system. And it was discovered intact in the 1880s. Technically it is intact, but the tomb itself had been sort of modified or changed during a few generations after Senedjem by members of his family. So technically it was intact from antiquity and from his family line, but the burial itself had been tampered with, slightly modified. All clustered together out of TT1, which were surmounted by small pyramid chapels where people could make their offerings, put a stela in to commemorate the individual, as well as up here. People would bring offerings here, and then the concealed shafts that you see here, those lead to the actual burials. For those of you who joined me on the Horemheb live stream a few weeks ago, you may notice that these tomb complexes kind of copy a style that Horemheb and his contemporaries were using, which is to make the whole thing, the whole tomb superstructure, look a little bit like a temple. Well, actually, not a lot like a temple, with the pylon gateway, a little staircase to access the courtyard, and then a kind of tripartite or three-part sanctuary at the western end, then with the tomb shaft concealed within. So really around the time of basically Horemheb, Ramesses I, Sety I, Ramesses II, this little temple tomb style seems to be the thing for wealthy families and individuals who are building their sanctuaries, both at Saqqara, which is where we find Horemheb, and at Deir el Medina for Sennacherib. This just gives you a sense of the burial itself. So we have Sennacherib, his father-in-law, and his son, and this is all classed as Theban Tomb 1. But the actual entrance shafts are here. Today, you access it through a modern passage or staircase that brings you down into this room, and then you can enter down here into the burial chamber. This is the modern entrance that you can see. So the modern entrance is not how you would have accessed it in antiquity. It would have been a shaft, but it still gives you an idea. And again, we have these sort of the barrel vaulted arch. This is a photo from, well, a reconstruction by the website OsirisNet of the substructure of the tomb itself. So you can see up here, these are those little pyramid chapels that I showed just a second ago. Then the shaft comes down here, and then you enter down into the passages. Whereas today, you just take a tunnel or a staircase tunnel straight through to here. Basically, they've just dug a tunnel through here. This is the reconstructed pyramid chapel above TT1. There would have been another one here and another one just over here, but this has been rebuilt to give you a sense of what it should have looked like. And on top, there is a little pyramidion, pyramid capstone. Some of them do survive physically, including this one for Ramose, who was a scribe of the tomb, so kind of the manager of Deir el Medina in the early to middle reign of Ramesses II. He's got a really interesting story that I'm looking forward to telling on the podcast, because he's got quite a well-recorded career progression from one job to the next. And we have his pyramidion that includes him worshipping Ra Horakti, or in this case, it looks like Atum, who is sitting in front of the mountain of Deir el Medina, or the Western Necropolis. You can see the curvy lines here to represent the mountain. This is the western hill, and the god is sitting in front of it. Oh yes, we have Ra Horakti down here, and Atum here. And Ramose venerates each one in a clockwise direction. Sense of direction is all off. This is the west wall of the burial chamber of Sennacherib, showing Sennacherib himself and his wife Ii Neferti before deities of the underworld, venerating them. They're sitting within their shrine, all grouped together. I had to digitally upscale this image because I couldn't find a good one of this particular wall. So some of the details might be slightly wonky. So just take a note of that. Here is the actual tomb itself, as you would see it today. This is on just above. We have these two Anubis deities who are seated upon their shrines with lotus flowers and nice little sashes. But you can see the beautifully preserved decoration on the plaster, and you can still see the kind of the paint, which is really nice. Adds a lot of nice texture to the image itself. This is on the opposite side, on the east, towards the sunrise. We have the solar deity, Ra, or in this case, Khepri, Ra riding on his solar barge, greeted by the baboons, who anecdotally or sort of informally I've heard that they tend to do that in the morning to warm their hands, and that might have been interpreted by the Egyptians as a form of praise to the sun god. Either possibly interpreted literally, but maybe also just used as a visual motif for praise. And then really, this is a replica in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, showing the really beautifully detailed idea of life in the next world. Kind of similar to the one that I pointed out earlier from another tomb, harvesting crops, tending to the cattle, enjoying the fruits of the trees, with abundant water and canals everywhere and small lakes. And Senedjem gets to sit and enjoy the nice smell of the lotus flower, while the great deities themselves are blessed by Senedjem and Nefertiti, and he receives his opening of the mouth from his son Khonsu, who I mentioned earlier. Pardon me. Again, some lovely Cairo info for you, photographs of the various walls. It's a really hard chamber to photograph because on the one hand, the lighting is not great. It's kind of just cold white LED kind of lights, but also there's glass panels around the walls, obviously to protect them, which is good, but it does make it very hard to photograph some sections. Somehow Cairo info for you got really nice photos of everything. I don't know exactly how he does it, including Senedjem and his wife Nefertiti worshipping the goddess Nut, who is emerging, I should say, from a sycamore or persea tree with offerings for them in return. That's kind of cool. She's literally, they've quite cleverly incorporated, like, the roots are her feet. Like, she has her toenail here in her foot, but she is also the tree herself. So really, really high quality artistic work. Again, we're not looking at royal quality here. You know, this doesn't match up with Sety I in terms of he's got the relief carving, he's got the very fine chiseling. Here it's just plaster, paint on plaster. But you get a lot more vibrance, I think. You get a lot more personality from this kind of art than you necessarily do from Sety. Sety's very formal, very very austere, religious in its subject matter and tone, which is completely appropriate and necessary for the context. But somebody like Senedjem, he gets to put whatever he wants. He doesn't have any specific rules he needs to include because he doesn't have those expectations or obligations. He can go as creative or as imaginative as he wants, and you get lovely things like this. Newt emerging from a tree, that's cool. Again, this actually gives you an example of like the lighting kind of bouncing off the glass, which is between this and the wall. So it can be really hard to photograph. So we should all appreciate Cairo info for you because stuff is always excellent. Just Osiris in his shrine with the one of the emblems of Abydos, which seems to be an animal skin, like a goat, attached to a fetish pole. Senedjem down here makes offerings to Osiris, hoping to receive the blessings of the deity in the afterlife. This is I used this as the front photo at the start. This is Senedjem being prepared for burial by, however you want to interpret it, it's either Anubis or it's the priest dressed as Anubis. But he receives the mummification, and he lies on a bed with a lion's head of the same type that was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. So strong connections between the art and the life. These are just some of the personal items that were found in the tomb burial, in the tomb itself. As I said, the burial was intact for Senedjem and several members of his family. So that included all of their personal items with which they were buried, like shabtis, which go into these small boxes. One of these are for Senedjem himself, but his wife Nefertiti also has her own ones. This is the outer coffin of Sennacherib from an exhibition that's currently traveling around called Ramesses and the Gold of the Pharaohs. Some of you might have seen, depending on where you live. Sennacherib's outer coffin, which was discovered in his tomb, was in that exhibition. So you might have seen this in person recently. It includes things like the sons of Horus, scenes of the underworld, texts from the Book of the Dead. Around this time, again, this is something I'll get into more in the podcast. For most of these Deir el Medina tombs, they're using the Book of the Dead as their primary text. They don't tend to have the fancy royal ones like the Litany of Ra or the Amduat. They might have little snippets from the Amduat, but very rarely the whole text. They don't usually have the Book of Gates. That tends to be at the royal level. These people tend to have the Book of the Dead as their primary text. Within this coffin were these nested coffins, including the outer one and the inner. This is the outer one, really beautifully made. Again, it's not up to somebody like Tutankhamun, but in its own way, it's equally beautiful and equally evocative, because that Sennacherib would have carefully organized this himself. Somebody like Tutankhamun, a lot of that's being done for him or on his behalf. Maybe he's inspecting it. Somebody like Sennacherib, he was probably checking this coffin out at the workshop regularly to make sure it had what he wanted. He clutches the Tiet knot, which is sacred to Isis, or Aset, I should say. And it's broken off here, but it's probably the Jed pillar for Osiris. So he's got the emblems of the mother and father deities there. While Nut stretches out her wings over his chest. He wears a nice little beard, which seems to have become quite a common motif around this time. And he's got the long it's not a headdress, it's a wig. But the long hair is very typical of the late 18th and early 19th dynasty. That's the style at the time, just like wearing an onion on your belt. Richly decorated along the body. It's wood, obviously, and it's been carved in the shape of the body itself, with sort of bulge for the, where are we looking at? This would be around the midsection, and then a bulge for the calves leading down to the feet, decorated with deities like Anubis upon his shrine. This would either be Isis or Nephthys, possibly, but they're clutching the Shen loop, which is where we get the cartouche. If you take that little loop with the line at the end and then stretch it out, that makes a cartouche. And that's a symbol for eternity. So they're giving him eternity, preparing for him eternal life. This is the it's either, depending how you classify it, it's either the inner coffin or the mummy board, which nestles within the outer. The lid that we just looked at goes on top here. Again, very finely detailed with the headdress. Not as richly detailed as the outer, because I guess the logic is that this is the one that's going to be seen during the rituals and the funeral. This is not supposed to be seen. This is just supposed to preserve the essential features, but the detailing is much less careful here, you can see. You could also argue that it's a lot more kind of true to life. This is ornate, this is funerary, this is formal. This is me with my kilt, no shirt, and a necklace around. This is closer to the body, as it were. So visually, it's more similar to the body as well. This is the outer coffin here, and the mummy board is lying on the inside. Usually the sons of Horus proceeding, sometimes with texts from the Book of the Dead. You have the titles of, pardon me, Sennacherib down here, like the Sedjem Ash, which is servant, in the place of truth. The Ma'at part is probably curved underneath here. And then Sennacherib, his name, and then Ma'aheru, meaning true of voice or deceased. There was also in the burial was Sennacherib's wife, Neferti, who was the lady of the house, or Nebet Per. one of the interesting things about Nefertiti is that there's a very, very strong chance that her family is actually Syrian. Her mother is called Ati, that seems to come from the Hurrian Ataya, and her father is called Cher, which apparently comes from the Hurrian Zili. I'm not entirely sure how that works because I don't read any Hurrian, but based on a couple of scholarly studies of the foreign names that I've seen, apparently Cher comes from Zili, and it's some reflection of how the ancient Egyptians hear, like the scribes, how they're hearing these particular names and transcribing them as best as they can in their own languages. That is something that I've encountered with my wife, who's teaching me Korean. My wife is Korean, and sometimes there are consonants or combinations of consonants where when she's trying to teach it to me, I physically cannot hear the difference between the two consonants. If it's written down, I can see it. And when she speaks it very slowly, I can distinguish it. But if it's just spoken at normal speed, there are certain consonants or sounds that it's almost like my ear cannot physically distinguish them because it hasn't learned to. Something similar might be happening with names like Cher becoming Zili. So if it's like Cherry or something like that, or Chili, the Egyptians are not able to exactly render that into their own language. So they have to adapt it as best they can. Anyway, Nefertiti seems to come from at least northern stock or heritage, if you want to call it that. Obviously, we can't say they were immigrants. Might have been second, third, or fourth generation, and they've just kept the names as a reflection of their origins. But that she is not the only one who has these kind of foreign connections. There actually does seem to be a sizable contingent of Syrians and Nubians, fair enough, living and working at Deir el Medina. It's not just an Egyptian village, which is what you might assume given the job they're doing, working on the tombs. But as I'll cover in a future episode, there actually is a lot more evidence for foreigners in the village than you might expect. Anyway, her burial goods and her mummy were also in TT1, including the mummy mask, which I'm pretty confident this is hers, but it is displayed next to another one, and they're not labeled, which is really frustrating. So one of these is Nefertiti, and one of these is her daughter-in-law, but I couldn't discern which one was which exactly. I think this is Nefertiti based on the earrings, which would indicate higher status versus the other one. Also the hairstyle, which is close to, similar to the wig of Merit. And also this one just has a closer resemblance, I think, to the coffin that we'll see in a bit. That's always subjective though, hard to tell. Anyway, here is it in detail. These particular items are in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, which is in eastern Cairo near the airport. Really lovely display, which I highly recommend if you get a chance to go to Cairo. Don't skip the Nemek. Do go there. You get to see all of these lovely items. You get to see the royal mummies, and you get to see a very nice overview of artifacts from all Egyptian history right up to the early modern period. So highly recommend this museum. Don't skip it. Even I know that the gem is going to monopolize people's attention for the next 5 or 10 years, but this one is a really great museum and should be visited. So one of these is the daughter-in-law. I think this is the daughter-in-law, and I think this is Nefertiti, but I could be wrong. This is the coffin of Nefertiti. So based on that, based on the earrings and the face, I think she's closer to that one, but maybe that's hard to say. I don't know. Anyway, these are the visual details of her coffin, including the lady herself, seated upon a nice chair, receiving offerings. While I love this little dude. The scribe is reading a little scroll before her, and it literally just has her names, and it says that this is made for the lady of the house, Nefertiti, which is really cool because you can imagine the scribe or the artist decorating this, maybe wants to include something more comprehensive, but it's too small, so he just puts the basics there. This is for Nefertiti and clusters her name in there. It actually looks like he's given her the short version of her name, which is just because I can't see the Nefertiti. I can see Ma'aheru, and I can see Ii, and I can see Nebet Per. It looks like she's just called Ii here on the scroll itself because it's too small, which is great. I love those little details where like artists don't finish their work, or they have to cram their work in, or there's not enough space, they can't get it right. That's the cool stuff for me, like the little personal details in there. Then nestled within her coffin was the mummy board, which overlay her actual body, and this is that, beautifully decorated. Again, kind of similar to Senejem's. This one is highly formal, richly decorated, because this is likely to be seen, at least during the funeral. Inside, it's truer to life. You know, she's wearing her robe. She's holding it cinched with one hand, like across her chest, like she's holding it tight around her body. Her feet are poking out. Much more true to life, much more evocative. These are some of the Sety figurines that were discovered in the tomb, including, you can see here on the right, one of them had its own little coffin and was wrapped up within it. And then there are boxes for the Sheties as well. They're all really nice. Again, you know, they're not, again, if we compare it to somebody like Tutankhamun, he has, you know, wood and gold and jeweled Sheties of the highest workmanship. But here they're making them more for themselves, or at least within the village. You know, they're commissioning the local Shety maker. I like these ones more, to be honest, because they have a lot more personality. Like, look at this cool little lady. I think it's a accident of the artistic process, but it almost looks like she's got one eyebrow raised in kind of like a, you know, amused or frustrated perception, emotion. Might be entirely unintentional, but I think these ones often have a lot more personality than the very formalized ones of the pharaohs. So always really nice to visit these. This is the chair of Senejem, and this is one of the stools for one belongs to Ii Nefertiti and one belongs to Senejem, but they've put it slightly upside down. Might be for Ii Nefertiti. Anyway, they're wood, which is painted. So probably not the most comfortable. Presumably you'd put a cushion or something on top of it, because can't imagine sitting on that for too long. It's going to be nice. Whereas this actual seat seems to have a bit more. This one is wood, but some of them, like Ka, they did actually have reed matting on the inside as well to make them more comfortable, which is nice. There's the chair again from the other angle, and we have things like these boxes for the Shety figurines. One of, at least, again, this is a family tomb, so part of these are for the descendants. Here's that little one that was wrapped up in these little caskets, which is cool. Small ointment jars. At the very start of the presentation, I showed you a funeral scene from Ramosa, how people on the with the carrying poles had the little jars hanging down. These are those kinds of jars that they often contain oils or cosmetics like creams or unguents, the sort of things that might be used in a opening of the mouth or the anointing ritual for the coffin or the mummy. Coffin, I should say. But then they're placed into the burial as part of the furnishings for the deceased. And they've got little, you know, stoppers with their nice little decorations and a nice variety of styles too. You know, not everything is exactly the same. They've got personal touches, and it looks like the texts have been drawn on top of the existing decoration, which is kind of interesting. Sort of giving you the sense that the pots are made and then bought by somebody and then monogrammed for them after they've been made. This is the lid of one of the Shety caskets, again with the Anubis upon his shrine, wearing his scarf, the Jed pillar of Osiris, and the Tiet knot of Isis. Everything packed into one nice little section on behalf of the deceased. This particular item belongs to Khonsu, the son of Senejem, whom we met earlier, with his title, you know, servant in the place of truth. Khonsu, truer voice, or deceased. So this belongs to the son of Senejem and Ii Nefertiti. And again, it's a really lovely piece. It's even got his name on the knob, so it's always identifiable for him. And that brings me to the end of this particular presentation. Again, I wanted to emphasize the visual material. So as always, I have to thank the priests among you who are far too generous with your money, but most greatly appreciated. If anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat right now. And otherwise, I'll wrap it up there with another one of these little pyramidions. And I will close down the shared screen and we will go back. So if anybody has any questions, now is the time to ask them. Otherwise, I will say farewell to you. Oh, hi, Eric. There's a priest in the chat. Eric is one of the priests, and you should all give him your adulation and praise. Okay. Doesn't look like anybody has any questions. I'll give it another minute. So as I said, this is kind of a part one of Deir el Medina because there's so much I can talk about. And maybe try and do what is the date today? It's the 8th for me. So the 15th, 22nd. With the 22nd, it's a little bit close to Christmas for a lot of people. So I imagine folks are traveling or going to visit family. Maybe we could try doing it in 2 weeks' time, or I could do the 29th after Christmas. Maybe that makes more sense, actually. So I'm going to try and do one again in about 2 to 3 weeks to kind of do a part 2 for those who are interested. Manin asks, will this talk stay on YouTube? I haven't decided. Usually the recordings go up for Patreon subscribers exclusively as a thank you for their support. But I haven't done the YouTube format before, so I might leave this one particularly on YouTube and then do the next one just for Patreon. But I'll decide. At the very least, part of it will go up on YouTube, maybe like the first bit as a preview. But I do try to. The logic basically is that the live stream is accessible to the public, to anybody who wants, but the recording is for Patreon subscribers as part of their rewards. Times are tough out there. People are giving me their money, which I'm very grateful for. The recordings are part of that, but we'll see. Chris asks, were the jobs as workers in Deir el Medina officially hereditary, or was it more of a de facto hereditariness due to growing up with all the artists there? That's a good question. So for those not familiar, and I will talk about this on the podcast in more detail, most of the jobs in Deir el Medina seem to be hereditary. So a worker, his son becomes a worker. A scribe, his son becomes a scribe. A foreman, like a chief, his son becomes the foreman. And the logic there probably would be, these children grow up in that context. They grow up beside their fathers, watching them, learning from them, apprenticing with them day in, day out. Hypothetically, they're the best educated or qualified to do the work itself. But there are instances where a job doesn't go from father to son. It might go to somebody who is connected to the same family, like a nephew or a cousin, or it might go to an outsider. It does happen. So I think the best we can say is that most of the time it was hereditary, but there are exceptions to that. So I don't think we could say that it was a rule. More of a de facto thing would probably be the likely answer there. And whoever's, there might be circumstances why somebody doesn't inherit their father's job. Maybe they don't want it. Maybe they're not qualified for it by general consensus. They have the wrong temperament, or they never quite got the hang of it in a good way. Or maybe they get sick or something like that. They're not physically capable of it. Because there are definitely instances where you would expect somebody's son to take over, but then somebody else takes on the job. So I think the best we can say is that they don't have to be hereditary, but unless there's a good reason, they usually are. Bettina asks, how much of the houses is original and how much is reconstructed? By and large, everything you see is original, although there might be a layer of bricks on top of the original material to protect them, like just on the top of the walls. But 99% of what you see is original, just with some reinforcements on the edges. Like the edges of doorways, those tend to be quite fragile and friable. They're likely to collapse. So they might shore them up with new bricks and new plastering. Amer asks, is the story about the son who left to become a sailor an indication that not taking a father's job was frowned upon? Possibly. In that particular story, I think the son had, I might be confusing my tales here. The father is lamenting that his son went away and hasn't come back, as if the idea that he was going out to experience the world and get a bit of experience, I guess, in the rest of in other places, and then the problem is that he's not returning. So this is a random connection, but kind of like what the Amish do. They send their children out to experience the outside world, and then they have the choice to come back if they are committed to the family, to the community. I'm not saying there's anything formal like that in Egypt, but it might be a comparable example that the son has said, the father has said, go out, go experience the world, but come back because I need you to take up my position. And then in this particular story, he's lamenting, why haven't you come back? I hear that you're gallivanting around. It's time to come home. Whether there's a frowned upon element to that, I don't think I could answer that based on that particular story or evidence. I mean, certainly if we look at the Deir el Medina family trees, like the one I showed you of Senejim, the family is huge over generations. And the problem there is that very quickly you're going to have more sons than jobs. If the chief workman has 2 sons, only one of them can inherit his job. So almost by function of how human family trees work, you're going to have sons and daughters leaving the community fairly regularly. Not because they necessarily want to, not because they don't want to do the work, but because there simply isn't work available and they need to go make their own way in the world. In some cases, the parents might have said, hey, come back, we've got a job for you now. Why aren't you coming home? But the relatively restricted size of Deir el Medina as a workforce, in the days of Sety I, the workforce grows to about 68 people that we know. That's not that many, like 68 known workmen for the tomb. If each one of them has just one son, okay, fine, the workforce replenishes itself. But the second they start having 2, 3, 4 sons, as many of these family trees do, you're very quickly running out of jobs. And the workforce doesn't seem to grow that much. In fact, sometimes it shrinks. In the days of Ramesses II, they actually reduced the size of the workforce on the royal tomb. We don't know why, I'll cover that in the future. But you can imagine that when they did that, when they went from, we used to have 70 workmen on the tomb, now we're going down to like 45, there's at least 25 families who are suddenly out of a job. That's a problem, Yeah. Okay, asks, when would the villagers have had the time to work on their own tombs? Good question. So if you think about the construction of the tombs themselves, like they've got these long, narrow corridors, and then they open out into big halls and rooms, and then they can constrict again. Because of the architecture of the tomb, you don't need every worker every day, all the time. At the very start, you're probably only going to want the builders, the actual workers who are digging the passages. And then the artists are going to start coming in. But the whole time that they're digging the passages, those artists don't have anything to do. And that's probably when those artists are working on either other commissions, like other tombs that are being built, like the tombs of a nobleman or the Queen's tomb. When those are being built, they're probably cycling through them repeatedly based on where they are needed. And then presumably the King's tomb is like the top priority, right? So whenever it gets to a part where, okay, we have room for everybody, then sure, everyone's gathering in on the royal tomb to decorate it and carry on working. But just by the physical constrictions of the space and the nature of the process that they're working, they're digging first, getting it stable and secure, then they're preparing the walls, then they're decorating. You don't need everybody every day, all the time. They're going to come back and forth based on need. So with that in mind, that's when they're probably building and decorating their own tombs, is on those days where they are not required at the major project. And if they're working on a tomb close to Deir el Medina, the Valley of the Kings is far away, it's hard to get to. But if they're working on like the Valley of the Queens, that's close enough that they're coming back home every night. So maybe that gives them an hour or two every day. So they're probably chipping away at them literally in those kind of small ways. Chrissy asks, do we know the average lifespan of a Deir el Medina worker? No, not specifically, but based on general studies of things like child mortality in the early modern period, like the medieval Egyptian, studies of the society and demography, we know that the vast majority of children don't make it out of infancy. They die from illnesses, malnutrition, sudden infant death syndrome, those kind of things. That skews the life expectancy metric in a big way. So we know about a lot of people, but some of those people may not have lived to adulthood. Generally speaking, as best I understand it, the idea seems to go, or the rule seems to go, that once you make it out of the danger zone of childhood, and assuming you don't get a terrible illness that knocks you off, you have a pretty good chance of living to 50s, 60s, even 70s. But the big caveat there is illness. These people don't have a medical technology that can overcome most diseases. If you get hit with even a bad flu, in some cases, that can kill you. So for one thing, go get vaccinated. For another thing, that's good. That makes it really difficult to pinpoint their average lifespan specifically. But I think you could say that if you made it out of the danger years of childhood and you had a pretty good run in terms of your health, you can probably look at your 60s or your 70s comfortably. The caveat there is the healthcare. If you get sick, it's much more likely that you're going to die based on what we experience in modern industrialized medical societies. Bettina asks, would the inhabitants have been allowed to leave the city whenever they wanted, or was there some security in place to protect the royal tombs? I will answer that in future because that is a very big and complicated question, and there are some cool stories, but I'm not going to answer that right now. So let's put a pin in that one, and I'll come back to it. Graham asks, you might have said this early on, but do we know when the village ceased to be occupied? No, I didn't actually cover that, but we do know when it stopped being occupied, and that was in the 20th dynasty, specifically in the reign of one of the Ramesses. I forget which one. I think it might be the 6th. That seems to be when the village stops being occupied, and they move somewhere else. They're still working on royal tombs up to the reign of Ramesses the 11th, but somewhere around Ramesses the 6th or so, that's when they leave Deir el Medina. And there are reasons for that, mostly related to the breakdown of the security situation in that time period. A lot more instability, raiders coming in from like Libya and also from the south. Very big, very complicated story that that's one thing that I'm quite looking forward to talking about on the podcast. But basically in the late 20th dynasty, so I should say around, more like 1100 BCE, give or take, that's when things are starting to break down in Thebes enough from a security perspective. That's when they abandon the village and they move closer in towards, closer to the Karnak region is the most likely answer. Possibly also Medinat Habu, the fortified temple of Ramesses III. The workers seem to go to those communities. Okay, again asks, you notice that decorations on E.E. Nefertiti's coffin include a heart design. in much the same style we'd use now. Is that a common motif? I did not notice that. Let me bring it up. I have way too many slides. Why do I put so many slides? Nefertiti's coffin. Okay, share my screen again. Well, Nefertiti's coffin has a heart design. So it does, around the edges of the thing. I have honestly never noticed that. It might be a flower bulb. Looking at this one, it's got these little lines in it that suggest it might be a flower. So, and then you've got this little black line here, which is we do see in like bread mold shapes, this little crescent at the top. It might be a coincidence. It might be an illusion based on a combination of a flower and this other little design. But I have to look into that because I've never noticed that before in my life. And that's quite fun. So thank you. That's a really cool thing to point out. The crazy thing about so many of these coffins and these tombs, you can look at them 100 times, and sometimes these things will just completely slip you by. It's crazy how often that happens. Every time I visit like the tomb of Sety the First, for example, there'll be something new that I notice. And I visited that tomb, so many times. It's crazy how that happens. So that's really cool. Thank you. Okay, I have to look into that because never noticed that before in my life. So the screen is black now. We can't see. Crap. Then I will redo that. One moment, please. I'll try and bring that up again. Does that work now? Okay, right. So what I was talking about is these little things here. They look like hearts. I think they are flower buds because they've got little vertical lines in them, like a flower, and they've got these distinctive little almost like a crescent / a number 3. We see that shape in like bits of bread that are made and in the handles of daggers and things. So I think it might be a visual motif, and I think the combination of this might be creating the illusion of a heart, because you can see here we got the different colors. There's a paler color here, and then there's the shape, the outline shape of the crescent itself. And then we've got this little design that looks like a couple of flower petals with strands. So I think it might be a coincidence that it looks like a heart. What the heck did I do? Apparently I skipped everywhere. That's interesting. Learning something new. So I think that might be an illusion, but I will look into that because that's quite cool. So yeah. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of question time. So I will call the live stream there. If you do have any other questions, just write them down and bring them along to the next one. As I say, I'll try to do one maybe in 2 or 3 weeks. I think I'll go for the 29th because at least that way everybody's, if you're celebrating Christmas or whatever, you're wrapping up with that and you don't need to worry about family or travels, hopefully. Whereas on the 22nd, people are probably busy. So I'm going to try and do one on the 29th again. We'll try and get 2 in this month so that when I go quiet in February, at least you have some stuff to look back on. So thank you everyone for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed it. One question, compared to Zoom, did you find this YouTube version was better? I think it might have been better for the chat. Much easier to sort of keep track of how the chat's going, whereas with Zoom, it's like everything's siloed off and you can't access it while you're actually streaming, or it's much trickier to do. So I might carry on with the YouTube, but we'll see how it works, especially in the post-processing, because I have no idea how the recording quality is going to turn out. One reason I wanted to switch away from Zoom is that they've recently lowered the quality of all of the recordings, and nothing I tried seemed to make it any better. So that's why I decided to try YouTube. Anyway, if this worked well for people, we'll do this next time, probably in about 3 weeks. So hopefully I'll see you then, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Take care, everyone.
Hello, I'm Dominic. Thanks for watching the History of Egypt podcast on YouTube. If you'd like to learn more about the show, including our social media, Patreon, and Discord server, you can find a link in the episode description. Thanks for watching.